Joining us now, our Wednesday regular TSN Hockey Insider, one half of the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast. Pleasure to welcome back to the show, Mr. Darren Dreger. How you doing?
I'm doing well, guys. Thank you.
Canucks feature on Insider Trading yesterday. Your colleague Pierre Lebrun doing the heavy lifting on the reporting, Dregs, but we'll hear from you as well. Andrei Kuzmenko, whose agent Dan Milstein had previously said, look, we want to go to unrestricted free agency. We want to see what the market will bear for a player who, of course, was limited salary-wise coming over from the KHL. Now reports that there are a lot of teams keen on him as a trade target and that it may take a $6 million per year bridge deal, much like Artemi Panarin signed with Chicago years ago with Milstein as the agent to keep him in Vancouver. Which way do you see this one going?
Well, look, I don't know that Patrick Galvin and Jimmy Rutherford have a hard stand on what the ceiling is financially on Andrei Kuzmenko. I don't think that they'd be scared by a bridge deal. Let's see a little bit more. In saying that, though, I don't think that anybody should be surprised at how productive he's been this season. Whether it was Dan Milstein, who's got vested interest, or any number of general managers pro scouts who watched him play in the KHL, the belief was this guy was going to step into the National Hockey League and pretty much do what he's doing. So, Vancouver won a sweepstakes here. So I don't think that you push away, but you do have to be aware of what your needs are, right? And, so does Andrei Kuzmenko on a bridge deal help you more than what the return might be for Kuzmenko via trade? And I don't think that the Vancouver Canucks are at that place just yet, only because of where we're at in the midway point of the regular season. You look at the contending teams around the National Hockey League, he is a low-cost, very productive asset. So that means if Vancouver is going to entertain anything, it's going to have to be a premium return. But from a Canucks perspective, you have to listen because of all your needs. Again, the young center, the right shot defense, go down the list of everything they need. So it's too soon to say how this is going to play out.
Well, I was going to ask, Dregs, is his market bigger than Horvat's market because the contract is so easy to fit? Are there teams out there just salivating for him because he's nearly a point-per-game player on a contract that just walks right into your lineup with no subtractions?
Well, I can't say it's greater than Horvat, but it's got to be right there. You bring in that piece and, the negotiation with Milstein doesn't go the way that you want. I mean, chances are you're not making that trade until you've had the freedom, the flexibility to talk to Dan Milstein to get a ballpark idea. But the ballpark idea is out there because Pierre Lebrun has reported it, right? I mean, it's going to be a $6 million tag or more on a bridge term. So, as a team that's acquiring, do you have the stomach for that? And if you're a team that feels like you've got an opportunity here to win a Stanley Cup or contend for that Stanley Cup, those windows close pretty quickly. So I think that the interest would be right up there with Horvat, if not a little bit more, just given the financial flexibility in this.
How much does a team meeting, the yearly team meetings that happen kind of 5 weeks before the trade deadline, and the Canucks are undergoing those this week, how much does that kickstart something for a team in the Canucks perspective, in the Canucks position? Does that mean that it's likely to happen next week, something, or is this just about a game plan and it still could take another 3-4 weeks?
It could still take some time, Blake, but how much does it mean? It means a lot. I mean, you put your scouts in a room, you pay these people for a reason, right? They've scoured the NHL. You've read their game-by-game reports coming back. Here are the players of interest. Here are the assessments and the statements on that player. Then you get into meetings like the one the Vancouver Canucks and other clubs are going through now or in the very near future, and you 100% map out what your strategy is and your game plan is for the March 3rd trade deadline. Now, how quickly you can execute on that, you got to have a partner that's willing to dance sooner rather than later. But we know, because we've talked about it so much, that's the MO of Jim Rutherford. And I assume that would be the direction of Patrick Galvin. They've established all along with clubs, look, we'll move Brock Besser, we'll move Bo Horvat, we'll move any of the pieces we don't have a timeline. March 3rd trade deadline is the obvious one, but we're willing to do business right now. So bring us offers. And I'm sure that they'll reinforce that coming out of these meetings.
And just in case there was anybody still thinking they were in the playoff race, granted, it's just recency bias here, but man, the last handful of games for the Vancouver Canucks have seen some of their worst of the season. You'd have to think the vision is uniform now, is unanimous going into these meetings.
I would think so. And look, I feel like that's more or less been the direction of management all the way through this season. The market is a little bit different, and the fan base look back to last season. Boudreau comes in, and the team goes off and has a more or less a good finish to the year. So the expectation to start the year was high, but I think that management had a pretty good understanding of the holes in this roster and the things that they knew that they were going to have to address. So maybe this just makes it abundantly obvious where the Vancouver Canucks are, but you still want the environment to be competitive, right? You still want your younger players to be in a healthy situation so that they're able to take the next step.
Dregs, we heard from Jim Rutherford this week via Pittsburgh columnist. He was quite wistful about his time with the Pittsburgh Penguins. He revealed that his mental acuity just wasn't there after COVID or the pandemic to continue doing the job, and he mused a little bit about retirement. We're asking on our Bodog poll question today, will Rutherford be with the Canucks next year? What are you hearing? Is it all getting a little too much for him here in Vancouver?
I mean, I would be shocked if he wasn't with the Vancouver Canucks, but I was shocked when he left the Pittsburgh Penguins in the fashion that he did. I mean, let's take stock of the man's career here. He's won Stanley Cups. He's 73 years old. I know his family loves Vancouver. So I feel like it would take something fairly significant, either personally or ownership wanting a change, for Jimmy Rutherford not to be back as president of the Vancouver Canucks next year. But look, I know because I've had the conversation with him. And in fairness, he was very open and honest in the Pittsburgh reporting. He was, he spoke glowingly of his time there. He talked about the friendships that he still has, although he does respect distance and doesn't connect with them very often. That, again, is out of respect to the job that has to be done in Pittsburgh. But COVID hit us all differently, didn't it? And I can tell you that Rutherford and his family deeply adhered to the restrictions and the protocols, right? So the social aspect and feeling somewhat responsible for his young son, having to endure all of the restrictions and whatnot. I mean, did it take a toll on him? I don't know. I mean, I've had those basic conversations with him. So I think that that's what he was speaking to when he spoke so honestly in the report. But, man, there's still fire in that belly. There is. And until that fire stops burning, I think that he's going to do whatever he can to help the Vancouver Canucks. But in the piece, he also talked about how he thought that they'd be more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but turning a corner, and felt like, some of the cap issues that, they're going to have to deal with in the future. He thought that some of that might have been remedied by now, either in the offseason or via trade, and that hasn't happened. So Jimmy's been around the block a bunch of different times. So as he again alludes to, when the stress becomes too much for him to handle, then he'll step away. But I don't get that sense that that's anytime soon.
Let me ask this by way of follow-up, because I know a lot of Vancouver Canucks fans are interested in how their hockey head of operations, whether that's a general manager or president, manages, and this ownership group manages up. I don't dispute that Rutherford left Pittsburgh because of the pandemic and all the complications, but did he have a trade squash there by management? Did he want to move on Letang and ownership said no? I know they were preparing for a sale, so that's often that's often a tricky waters to navigate if you're the sports ops head trying to do your bidding while recognizing the ownership above you, maybe prepping the team and looking for certain financial targets to be met. Did he have trade squash there? Did he wind up not being able to manage up with Mario Lemieux and Ron Burkle?
Well, I don't know the specifics of that, to be fair, Matt. So I'm not going to comment on whether it was Letang or it was something else. I mean, I've heard all of that. And I remember having the conversation with Jimmy shortly after the announcement was made, and he just didn't want to get into it. It feels like there was something that, created a line whereby he felt like he couldn't do his job to the best of his ability, or maybe there had been a trust erosion above him, and that was called out, to your point, on a specific hockey operations decision that he wanted to make that he was being pushed to not making. But look, I mean, general managers and presidents of hockey operations have to have that communication, those discussions and disagreements with ownership. That's just part of the business. So that's why I'm hesitant in saying, was it one thing? Was it a series of things? I can't be sure. Only Jimmy and those involved in Pittsburgh would know the specifics of that. But I do believe something pushed him to make the decision that he made at the time.
Dregs, do you think there's any possibility that we get clarity on the salary cap before the trade deadline? Do you think there's any opportunity for anybody to come forward and say, "Oh, it's looking better for a $3 million or $5 million dollar bump"?
It feels unlikely, and I'm going back to the Board of Governors meetings and conversations that I had with sources from the National Hockey League Players Association. You know, the PA didn't feel like it was necessity to get, a presentation to the NHL sooner rather than later, and felt like, probably they could hold out until June. I'm not sure that's wise. Because
this
it has
is on
to
escrow negotiations, or
it's just generally a bump, right?
Yeah.
And nobody, especially the players, want escrow negatively impacted. They certainly don't want it to elevate, but there isn't the sense of urgency to pay back the player's share that maybe there once was. They know they have to pay it back. They can see that the end is coming to have it paid back, but whether that's in the next several months, whether that's a year and a half from now, what's the rush? There are some inside the Players Association that believe that having more money in the system, a $2-3 million bump, is more beneficial than actually paying off the player's share. But fellas, that's how the CBA is written, right?
Yep.
It's written on that timeline. So this is probably one of those age-old negotiation tactics by both the PA and the NHL. The NHL is like, Bettman was adamant that he was not going to talk about this publicly to the media assembled in Florida because he didn't want to engage in a public negotiation. All that is a shot over the bow to the PA saying, well, make your presentation to bump the cap and change how it's written in the CBA, but guess what? We're going to want something back. I don't think that Bettman or the owners have any reluctance to bump that cap by an extra $3 million plus. I don't. Because it creates a little bit more interest and a little bit more wiggle room. This is just Gary Bettman playing poker and seeing what he can squeeze out of the PA in the process.
Timeline on the trade deadline, Dregs. We discussed last week that some teams are so tight to the cap or over the cap in LTIR that they're going to want to wait till March 3rd to get as much accrued space as possible. But there are some teams like Winnipeg, a couple others that have some cap space. There are some players being peddled, and the Canucks have a couple like Kuzmenko and Schenn who are cheaper against the cap. What's your forecast to when we start seeing the trade? Rutherford's always been known as an early mover, right? What's your forecast on when you think we're going to start to see dominoes fall here?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say it's in the next week, 2 weeks. Normally you get towards the latter part of January and things do start to percolate a little bit more. I can tell you that the conversation has been more active, but it feels like it's kind of swirling more around defense right now, right? In insider trading, Pierre LeBrun talked about the Edmonton Oilers, Kenny Holland making his calls on defense. I talked about, Edmonton and Ottawa and other clubs calling Billy Guerin and the Minnesota Wild on Matt Dumba, who's an unrestricted free agent. What's going to finally become of Jacob Chikrin and the Arizona Coyotes. So, I mean, you're at a point in the near future here. We're at the midway point now where, Edmonton isn't necessarily locked into a playoff spot, right? I mean, they might need to do something through necessity here in the very near future. Ottawa feels like Pierre Dorion has waited too long. So that's what normally triggers action, right? Is when you get that sense of desperation. But I feel it less with forwards than I do with defense because of the teams that just flat out need an upgrade or need help on their blue line.
Last one for me here, Dregs, and I think we've asked you a similar question sometime during the season. And if the Canucks were winning 2 and losing 2 the rest of the year, I think you hold on to Bruce Boudreau, you just let him finish. It's easy peasy. there's two trigger points that I wonder that might change the equation. A, it gets ugly. Like if games like last night become the regular, where they become embarrassing, do you have to move on Boudreau then? Or if they end up trading, let's say it's Shen, it's Kuzmenko and Horvat, and you've got a really different group now all of a sudden, do you make the change there just so that it's somebody else other than Boudreau with the first clause in the new group? Is that a scenario you see playing out, or do you still think Boudreau the rest of the year?
No, that's a scenario I see playing out, and I've maintained this for several weeks. I think that the coaching change is going to happen in season. I always targeted February for whatever reason. It's just prior to the trade deadline. But then that allows whoever is coming in, and maybe it's an internal bump, right? You guys last week, we talked about Jeremy Colleton. Yep. That doesn't make as much sense to me. Not because, I don't think he can be a good coach. It's just, are you going to commit to him longer term? I don't think you do that until you know what the coaching market looks like in the off season. So it's probably Mike Yeo, someone internal, but the focus has to be on committing to a structure, which is challenging, right? Because if Mike Yeo isn't the long-term fit, or the internal candidate isn't the long-term fit, then maybe the new coach coming in has a different idea of what that structure, those systems and all of that look like. I just know that, the Canucks want to be a team that's ready to hit the ice in full flight next season. Full flight. Not go through a full-on rebuild yet again. They feel like they've got good young pieces, but those good young pieces who are in the league or have been shuffled to the American League that should be in the NHL, they need to have meaningful games under their belt this season. So if that isn't Boudreau, then that's going to be someone internal. And I just think for all the reasons structurally and otherwise that we've talked about, it's probably not going to be Bruce.
Marvelous stuff, Darren. Thank you for your time here today. Great to see you again. We'll catch up next Wednesday.
Okay, guys. Thank you.